Let's begin with a quick prayer. Father, we ask that you will always give the church the leaders necessary to educate us and to follow your teachings. We ask this in the name of Jesus, the Lord. We're going to look today at the year 1245. It's the birth of Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas was the son of a local count, and his father had great ambition for his son, who was a very brilliant child, but he wanted to see his son end up abbot at Cluny, which we mentioned was the big monastery that so influenced the church and was often the source of bishops for all over the world. And so he envisioned his son as being the, the abbot one day at Monte Cassino. So at the age of 5, his father turned him over to the monks of Monte Cassino, and he was raised there. As he got older, the first thing he did was go to study at the University of Naples. Naples was probably the third most important university at the time. Finishing there, he had the opportunity at Naples. I think you know where Naples is on the map, but he had the opportunity in Naples to deal with the Muslim teaching. Now remember the importance of the Muslims at this point with regards to the Catholic Church. The importance of the Muslims is they're carrying the teachings of the Greek philosophers that had been lost in the West. And the teachings of the Greek philosophers were fantastic in philosophy and fantastic in mathematics, those two areas. But for our side of the whole thing, it's theology, philosophy rather. So Thomas Aquinas has the opportunity in Naples to have a background in Aristotelian philosophy. He studied Platonism and the others, but Aristotle was the one he was really about. And so he comes out of the University of Naples and then went on to study at the University of Paris. He entered the Dominicans, and they sent him to the University of Paris, which, as we mentioned before, was the greatest university in the world at the time. There was a man there teaching. We know him in the church as Albert the Great, but Albert the Great was probably, in his age, the most significant thinker in the entire world. And Albert the Great, his field specifically was science. Now, allowing the mathematics had come out of the Muslim world too. So Albert was basically a science teacher. Now, he was a theology teacher too. He was a priest, and you didn't go into teaching without teaching theology. Everyone thought theology. But his particular thing was science. His writings would fill 38 very large volumes, and he wrote on everything. But his primary interest was science and a Catholic view of Aristotle. Now, Aristotle is one who dealt a lot more with science. Now, you understand that at this time, by Aristotle, the Greek philosophers, at that time, their dealing with science was observing what they saw and sort of thinking about it to try and put it together. I'll give you an example. Aristotle believed the butterflies were created by the corruption of leaves. And the reason he believed that is because in the fall, in the area where he lived, is where they had the most butterflies. So they would have a huge amount of butterflies in the fall, and he'd see them around the leaves. And remember, that's when the multicolored leaves come off the trees. So he'd see them around the leaves, and he thought somehow they were created by the leaves. That's very common in that kind of way of thinking. They would look at something and reason something that would make sense about it, but they didn't experiment. See, that's what will come into science with Newton. Newton will actually experiment. How many leaves does it take to make a butterfly? And he would approach it that way. But Aristotle and the Greeks just sort of looked at things and kind of reasoned. The thing that was unique about Aristotle was Aristotle spent much more time observing. More of his science was correct than any of the others. The others were much more into their reasoning. Aristotle used to look very carefully at things and then reason. Now, he wasn't always right, because that's not the way to approach science, but he was right more often than the others were. And so Albert was a very strong believer in Aristotle and wanted to get a Catholic view of Aristotle. Aristotle's form of reasoning is really magnificent. It really is. It's what we studied in the seminary. Thomas learned very well and himself became a famous teacher. And he began to write that faith, science, and reason could never be in conflict. Now, at this time in history, people sort of departmentalized, and they would have their idea of what they believed here, and they have their idea of what they experienced here. That would be reason. And then you would find science would deal with the things you and I can't reason about. But like, for instance, science would tell us that the planets circle the sun, okay? Theology at the time told us that the sun circled the earth, okay? And so you'd see differences in these things. The particular thing that Thomas Aquinas and Albert held this as well, but the particular thing that Thomas Aquinas brought was that science is the working of the universe, which was created by God. Theology is a revelation that was given to us by God. And reasoning is our way of understanding both what God tells us and what we see in the world around us. And he says, since the source of all of this is God, they cannot be in conflict. Okay? They simply can't be in conflict. And sometimes we have things in theology that do end up in conflict with science. And when that happens, what you need to do is not abandon the theological principle and do not deny the facts of science, but somehow figure out how it works out. Now, a couple of examples of this is the idea of the sun going around the earth, which, the scriptures talk about the rising of the sun and all this sort of thing. And we know from science that the earth circles the sun. So what happens over a period of time? Over a period of time, we end up in theology with what's called form criticism. Form criticism is the ability to look at something in the way it's written. An example would be if we have the president give a speech, you can see the president's speech, basically the content, on the front page of the newspaper. You can go to the editorial page and find out what the editor of the paper thought of the particular talk. And you can go to another page and see a cartoon about the president. Now, these are all three views of the same thing. And if you're looking for humor, the cartoon is a correct analysis of what the cartoonist sees in the president. The editorial is a correct analysis of what the editor sees in the president. And in the words of the president, you see a correct analysis of what the president thinks. And so these three things are really different ways of looking at the same thing. So they came to that. They said, when the scripture says the sun rises, the scripture isn't wrong. Poets say that all the time. We have no problem with it. Because when we speak of what we look at, we see, for our point of view, the sun moves. So it was speaking poetically, not science. Science-wise, the earth goes around the sun. But looking at the instance from our earth, it looks like the sun rises and the sun sets. So they came to this. It's called form criticism. And today, it's one of the major ways of studying Scripture, to look at, see what's meant in the particular way it's sent. Thomas finally wrote a compendium of theology. It's called the Summa Theologica. That's the highest theology. Theology is the study of God. Theo is God, ology is study. Philo is wisdom. Ology is study, philosophy, okay? Or psychology, any of them. Psyche is mind, okay? So the Summa Theologica today is studied in seminaries. Now, I don't know how much it's dealt with, but when I went through the seminary, the Summa Theologica was what we studied for theology, period. And if we looked at anyone else, we saw how they agreed or disagreed with the Summa Theologica. But the Summa Theologica was the heart of what we studied when I was in the seminary. There was another student at the University of Paris at exactly the same time, and his name was Bonaventure. Now, we mentioned that, Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican. Bonaventure was a Franciscan. And while Thomas was very clear and methodical, Thomas is very easy reading. You know exactly what he says, and you know his stance on it. It's very, very clear. Bonaventure was much more mystical. The interesting thing is, Bonaventure and Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologica are studying exactly the same stuff. But you get a very mystical and, I guess, profound look into it with Bonaventure, whereas Thomas will not venture into that. He says very clearly what he knows and this sort of thing. Thomas and Bonaventure were completely opposed on one issue at the time, and that's the Immaculate Conception. Thomas maintained no one could be freed from sin before the death and resurrection of Jesus. So Mary could not have been independent of sin. Bonaventure maintained that because with God there is no time, and the death and resurrection of Jesus would take place, Bonaventure maintains that everyone from Adam, Moses, the holy people we know in the Old Testament, where did they all get their holiness? He says it came from grace, and all grace comes from the death, resurrection of Jesus. But the death, resurrection of Jesus, the grace flows both direction in history. Okay? So they disagreed on that. And nothing wrong about disagreeing on that at the time, because no doctrine had been declared. Later on, they will declare the Immaculate Conception a doctrine, but at this time they hadn't. The period, I should also finish with Bonaventure held the same thing, that theology and science could not disagree. This period also saw the rise of Gothic architecture. We are most familiar with Gothic architecture as it came to the United States through Irish pastors. When Irish pastors came into the United States, Gothic architecture had been huge in England, Ireland, Scotland, those areas. And so they brought in Gothic architecture for the churches. Very tall, thin towers, very ethereal. The buildings were much more taller and much lighter. Like if you look at let's say the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in D.C., magnificent building, but a very heavy, heavy-looking building. Same thing with St. Peter's. St. Peter's is a very heavy-looking building. But if you looked at St. Patrick's Cathedral in Washington, which is Gothic, it appears to be very light, and that's thinner spires, all that sort of thing. And one of the reasons was there was a lot of light in the church. And part of the reason was a wall did not have to be supportive. They had what they called flying buttresses, and off a wall would come like wings. And these wings would actually support the building. And because they supported the building, they had huge open spaces for stained glass windows. So when you study stained glass, the huge windows that you see, magnificent saints and all that sort of stuff, all that comes from Gothic churches, because Gothic churches had great open spaces. They were massive and tall windows. Something most people don't know, that when you study glass, do you know that glass always remains a liquid? Glass is never actually solid. And if you leave a stained glass window over centuries, as they do in Europe, the glass in the window is much thicker at the bottom of the piece than the top over a period of time. And that's why those windows have to be redone periodically. Glass actually stays it's liquid, but it moves very, very slowly. The term Gothic as an art form, actually, to define this, came into use much later. And the word Gothic comes from the Gauls, who were the barbarians at the time and came out of and Gothic was a word used to condemn it. It would be like saying this architecture is barbaric. And so they used it to condemn the architecture. In 1245, Frederick was king of Germany and Sicily. He constantly feuded with the popes. He had a very exalted view of himself. And for some reason, he was much more interested in Sicily and didn't care a lot about Germany. And he functioned a lot more like a Muslim sultan, just decreeing things, than he ever did a European king. He was more interested in new ideas than he was in tradition. Now remember, Sicily is an area, again, where you have the intermix of the West and the Muslims. So you have this intermix there. And so he was much more interested in the new ideas. His writings we have, and he indicated that he seems to have been an intellectual. He founded the University of Naples, incidentally, where Thomas Aquinas had first studied. He prepared a code of law that is probably the best in the whole course of history up to this point. Laws, were most laws historically at that time were at the caprice of kings. So, murder was wrong, but if you performed a murder for the king or something, well, that was kind of acceptable. But the laws were very much at the caprice of kings. He made punishment of crimes much more humane. If you were to go back to the days of Jesus, there were 3 punishments for a crime. Let's say of a court case. There are 3 ends to a court case. One is you're executed, one is you're sold into slavery, and one is you're declared innocent. That was it. And so punishments seem to be very, very severe. And at this time, the major thing that he introduces is this humanity with regards to punishment, okay? And partially, this comes out of the Muslim tradition. They were much more, their punishments were very severe. If you're caught stealing, they cut off your right hand. I mean, they were very severe. But that's not as severe as being sold into slavery or executed. So they were seen as being more benevolent. But he was much more humane than that. And he brought about laws and punishments that were much more humane. In France, there was a house by the name of Anjou, and Anjou began to become very, very powerful in France. Frederick died, and there was no emperor now in Germany for 20 years. The empire began to disintegrate. Germany, Italy, and Sicily, each going their separate ways. They were held together basically by the emperor. In this house of Anjou, Charles, the House of Anjou, conquered Italy with papal support. The Pope wanted to get Italy out of the authority of Germany and stuff like that because the emperor was so powerful. And remember, the French had been very, very loyal to the church. One of the things about the French historically, they're very loyal to the church as such, but they're anti-clerical. They're very suspicious of clergy, but they're loyal to the church as such. And so the Pope really supported him as he took over this territory. And support began to change. Nicholas III became very uncomfortable with French power. And the idea was, you want a powerful supporter, but you don't want the supporter so powerful they could overthrow you. So this becomes this. When Nicholas III died, Charles of Anjou was powerful enough to make sure that a Frenchman was elected pope. And he became Martin IV. He was elected, and this was immediately followed in Italy by a large series of anti-French uprisings. This period of history actually saw, if you look at the good side, it saw missionaries of faith go into the East. They went into China, Russia, and the Mongol lands. And all of these actually were very fertile lands for the faith, because these people were tolerant of new ideas and different religious views. It's interesting, when you have a lot of religious views in a country, the United States being an example, people are usually willing to listen to other views, whether they convert to them or not. They're willing to listen to other views. When you have the whole country under a monotheistic religion, like the whole country is Catholic, or the whole country is Christian, or Muslim, or Russian Orthodox, or whatever, if the whole country is that way, it's very difficult to bring in new ideas. And one of the reasons is that in that instance, the religion and the country become so identified that to, let's say, like if you were to go back to the United States, even when I was a little child, if you were not a Christian, now you didn't have to be Catholic or a Baptist or something, but if you were not Christian, they were suspicious of you. And so we had a religion like the Mormons that people weren't sure they were Christian. And so they had a bad judgment of them. Things like Jews were suspect. They just came out of that at the end of the Second World War, when people realized what anti-Semitism can lead to. But when I was a youngster, if you were an American, you were Christian. It didn't matter the denomination at all, but you were Christian. And I remember when they questioned about Putin, Putin was baptized as a child, and when they questioned Putin about his baptism, many of the communists did, his response was very clearly to be Russian is to be Russian Orthodox. That they see it as a national thing, it has nothing to do with the religion. But anyway, the Mongol lands were very open to these views, and they were widely discussed. In the 1300s, we began a terrible period for Europe. In 1348, the Black Plague, now the Black Plague was caused by mosquitoes, but it was carried by rats. It was bubonic plague, and it became known as the Black Plague or the Black Death. The reason why it's carried by the rats have the disease, but most people get it from mosquitoes, because the mosquitoes take the blood out of the rat and put the blood into the human being. Any infected person was almost sure to die, and it was a very terrible death. The plague lasted 3 years, and at the end of the 3 years, it had killed 1/3 of all the people in Europe. 1/3 of the people lost. There followed a period of food shortages for their great lacks of workers in the field. There were many peasant revolts, and they almost always failed. England and France were at war, villages were looted, and soldiers roamed the land, robbing peasants. One of the things you will notice in history, we've had several great plagues in history, but when a plague ends, there's a period of chaos followed by a brand new society. And that's what's going on here. The brand new society, because the society that built this up couldn't be sustained. Why couldn't it be sustained? Most of the serfs were dead. The serf system couldn't go on. This situation caused many people think of new ideas as to how to build a new society. Because transportation of goods was extremely difficult at this time, food could not easily be moved from one place to another. And people knew almost nothing about the causes and treating of diseases. It's a very different thing when we deal with injuries or diseases. When you deal with an injury, you can look at a broken arm, a broken foot, a broken leg, whatever. You can look at these things, and whether or not they could cure them or repair them, at least they knew what it was. But with diseases, people really didn't know much of anything. And so diseases like the plague could spread terribly. And some of the early medieval towns, the density of the population caused the disease to spread. We know that right now with the pandemic in the United States. We know that the principal cause of it is closeness of people. So during this period, clothing became the way in which people would distinguish social rank, class, wealth, and profession. You would dress according to this sort of thing. And why was this? This was because there really wasn't much distinction other than that. Like, for instance, if you came from a wealthy family, you basically were defined by wealth, but you didn't have a lot of money. And you didn't have a lot of food. You probably had to maintain your garden in order to feed yourself. But people were living pretty much the same, but their clothes would distinguish who they were. I have an interesting statue at home. It's carved wood. It's a reproduction of a medieval statue, but it shows the Virgin Mary with her cloak out on either side, her arms kind of like this. And inside her cloak are probably about 11 people. And they're all dressed very differently. And the reason why they are, if you know, each one of them represents a profession. And so this particular statue represents Mary as the mother of the church, holding the church together. But these represent different professions. And at that background, you could recognize immediately as what they were. Okay? In art, a very interesting thing in art was called the Dance of Death. And again, allowing that this plague had gone across Europe, one of the things, like when you have famine, normally the very wealthy are immune. If you have certain problems develop, some groups can be immune, some groups subject to it. You could go back and forth like that. But the thing that struck them about the plague was no one was immune. And so they have these magnificent, I've seen some stained glass windows, particularly in England, a stained glass window where there are about 5 people in the window. There's the king, a peasant, the pope. They represent different people. And beside each one is dancing a skeleton. And in the pope, for instance, the skeleton is reaching for the crown. The king is reaching for the crown. The peasant, he's taking the scythe out of his hand, the sickle out of his hand. And you see what it is death's ability to take everyone. It's called the Dance of the Death. Medieval towns were walled. And in these medieval towns, the most impressive building was the church. You could approach the town and see the church. Where you see that in many, there are many walled cities that still exist in Europe. Avila in Spain is an example of one, but many of them do. And outside the walls, all you see over the walls are church towers, basically. Jerusalem's that way. If you go around the wall of the city of Jerusalem, what you see rising above the city of Jerusalem are the towers and the prayer, the minarets of the Muslim community for the call to prayer. That's all you see rising above the city. Everything else is sort of lower than the wall. At this time, people were very loyal to the church. And it's interesting, I find this adjective used in a number of books. It says they're fiercely loyal to the church, and that's the people in general. But they are often very critical of the clergy. We see that in a lot of institutions. For instance, in the United States, I think most of us are really committed to the ideals of Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington. We're really committed to the ideals. So we're really committed to the United States as United States. But we are all critical of politicians on both sides of the aisle. Everyone's critical of them. And I think part of it is none of them can fully embody what these gentlemen did. So anyway, important changes began to take place in government, bringing about strong centralized power in the hands of kings, emperors, or organizations of aristocrats. That's called an autocracy. And when really important people get together as a group, they control the whole thing. That, incidentally, is the basis of a republican government. It's just the difference is it isn't wealthy people, it's elected people. That these people then sort of run the government. However, one of the reasons why this happens, when we go through a time of difficulty and society begins to fray and this sort of thing, we really want someone who is strong, powerful, and can take over and correct it. And someone who has any idea that will do it. One of the things you read in Das Kapital by Karl Marx is the idea that if you can bring a society to chaos, they will accept anything in order to end the chaos, which in his case means they would accept communism rather than chaos. But if you want them to have communism, bring about the chaos, and then they will accept the communism. Society was noblemen at the top, wealthy merchants, the trade guilds, this is organizations of people with trades, blacksmiths, artists, even stuff like that, and finally laborers. The merchants and the guilds got together. Now, I think you know the guilds, organizations of, as we mentioned, people who make things, blacksmiths and stuff like that. The merchants are the ones who sell those. So the merchants and the guilds sort of got together, and what they did was organized, and they began to install dictators. And these dictators took over from the kings, the aristocrats, and the noblemen. That the difference between a dictator and these other individuals, in the case of a dictator, the dictator's child does not necessarily come into power. Like, for instance, if I'm a leader and my son takes over from me and his son takes over from him, no matter what you call me, I'm a king. That's what makes kings, okay? And if I come in, claim to be a king, wear a crown and everything, and I die and my son isn't the one who follows me, but someone else comes, I'm not a king. Okay? That's a dictator type of thing. Okay? The church no longer had to fear any persecutions, and political powers now were becoming the danger. Basically, everyone was Catholic, everyone was fiercely committed to the church, and so the church didn't have to worry about governments moving against it and anything. But now they began to look at the local political powers. And again, these political powers were Christians. In 1284, the church had been without a pope for 2 years. Finally, the cardinals agreed to name a holy hermit by the name of Peter. I think you know the cardinals had to have a certain level of vote. I think it's 2/3, but I don't know what it is. But they had to have a certain level of vote. And so as they were looking around, they could not get organized. It's largely because it was a political fight. Some wanted one, some wanted the other, two camps. And when you have two camps, what they will ordinarily do is elect an elderly man. They did that with regards to John the 23rd. There was a camp that wanted the man who ended up Paul VI, who was Montini. But Montini was kind of young at the time. And so they wanted him. There was another camp that wanted someone else. So what they did was elect John the 23rd, knowing that at his age he wouldn't be pope very long. Next one would came. So what they did at this point was they decided to elect Peter. Peter was off in his hermitage, and he did not want to be pope, but he believed he could not refuse the call of the church. He was a very holy man, very, very good man. He took the name Celestine V. I say almost the worst pope we've ever had in history, to be honest. He did not know how to govern, and he trusted everyone. I think in politics that's not a virtue, but he trusted everyone. As a result, the church was tricked out of land, money, and power. The thing is, they would just take them from him. He resigned after 2 months. Imagine, lands, power, money in only 2 months. At the end of 2 months, he resigned. Cardinal Giustini helped him to write the letter of resignation, and then he was elected, curiously, and became Boniface III. He immediately imprisoned Celestine to make sure people remained loyal to himself, and Celestine would die in prison then. So he was maintained in prison. And incidentally, by prison, you might think in terms of house arrest rather than a prison cell somewhere, tortured to death or something. But he wanted to make sure Celestine did not go off and claim, oh, I didn't mean to resign, I'm supposed to be Pope, okay? Boniface believed that the Pope was the highest power on the face of the earth. But things had changed since the time when popes could get away with that. So the basis of power had shifted, and the kings would have none of his having all the power. In the beginning, actually, he was very successful as a pope. And I think partially people were just so glad to see Peter gone, Peter the Hermit. And in the year 1300, he proclaimed a holy year on a year of Jubilee. It was the first one of the Christian era. In Israel, they traditionally had what was called the Year of Jubilee, and it comes every 50 years. And here's the way it works. Let me take Passover. When you have Passover, after Passover, you have what's called a week of weeks. That's 49 days, 7 7-day periods. The last day is the 50th day. That's called Pentecost. So then Passover begins and ends with Pentecost, 50 days after Passover. So what they used to do was with years. They would take years. This period would be a week of years. So it's 7 7-year periods, at the end of which you have the Year of Jubilee. The Year of Jubilee in Israel, if I have sold land to you, it returns to my family. If I am in debt, all debt ends. If I'm in prison, I'm released. And everything goes back sort of to normal at that time. If you're enslaved, you're free. Everything goes back to what it was at the beginning. And actually, the Year of Jubilee was a manifestation of the sovereignty of God. No matter what society does, God ultimately is in charge. And so Jews had the Year of Jubilee. Well, he instituted a Year of Jubilee for the Christian community. And the Year of Jubilee takes place in the Catholic Church every 50 years, although periodically they will have another reason for having it. Like, for instance, I think we had one in the year 2000 to mark the change. But periodically they will move it one way or another. And what he attached to the Holy Year was very specific graces as far as forgiveness of sin and doing away with time in purgatory and stuff like that. But in order to get the benefits of this Jubilee, you had to make a pilgrimage to Rome. In protest, not a single one of the kings in Europe chose to participate. However, among the people, it was phenomenal. It was a welcome thing. And people came from all over and came to this. And in the period between 1300 and 1400, religious fervor deepened. People became more and more fervent about the idea of religion itself. People wanted to lead more sincerely Christian lives. I think all of us know the ideals of the Christian life. And I think most of us, I speak for myself, But most of us go through periods where we feel a strong call, like I want to be a more forgiving person and sort of work on that, or I want to be someone who's less attached to the things I own, so I work on that. Or I want to be someone who's seen as very helpful to other people, you work on that. Whatever it is, okay? And so what will happen is we do this, but periodically we have movements in the church that call people to be very deeply Christian in all kinds of ways and to last for a while. And so this began to come upon the church, and Christians began to gather in many, many different communities. And they would form individual communities as lay people, okay? Many of them went so far as to become heretical, like they would follow beliefs, and in their beliefs they would move outside Catholic doctrine. And we would watch this in different communities. In general, people were seeking to return to the authentic teaching as presented by Jesus Christ himself. However, many of them were very critical of the church and of its leaders. It's really interesting when you watch church history. If you take a time in which the clergy was very, very corrupt, the authorities of the church, it was really a mess. You take someone like Catherine of Siena. Catherine of Siena was one of the holiest people to walk the face of the earth, and she lived a very austere, holy life. It's interesting, she did everything she could to call the leaders to the reform, and she was very much at their service to help them. That was the time, remember, the Pope was living in Avignon, and she was trying to get the Pope to return to Rome and this sort of thing. But she wasn't critical. And I watch people who are really, really holy are not that critical of people who are not holy. They want to lead them and draw them, that sort of thing. But someone who's really critical of another person's unholiness, that doesn't speak strongly of their holiness to me. So anyway, preachers of penance and reform became extremely popular all over Europe. This is always amusing to me. When I was ordained in a particular community that was famous for preaching missions, and we'd go to parishes and preach missions. And we had 3 or 4 priests in the community who did that, who were very much into fire and brimstone. It was interesting. People liked that. It was very, very popular. So anyway, these preachers of penance and reform became extremely popular all over Europe. There were very many new convents established for women. And when they always had a Dominican or a Franciscan spiritual director. Now the Dominicans and the Franciscans, look at the Franciscans as into poverty and the Dominicans as into education. But both of them were into holiness. Holiness was a sporadic thing in the diocesan clergy, but it was a dedication you found in the Dominicans and the Franciscans. Now remember the great abbeys like Cluny and stuff like that. I don't know much about Cluny at this period, but many of the great abbeys were making so much money because of their farms and that sort of stuff that the monks were living in luxury. It wasn't a holiness thing, okay? However, often there was an effort to simply impose the rule and practices of male communities on these women, and it failed. The women's communities, when they got started, naturally, as I mentioned, their chaplain would have to be a man. Their chaplains tended to be Franciscans and Dominicans. So the Franciscans tended to make a rule for this religious community that was basically a Franciscan rule that was written for men. They didn't take the rule of Clare, for instance, that she had for her community. And the Dominicans would do the same thing. They would take the Dominican rule and they would impose it. And you begin to understand writing a rule for a religious community is an amazingly complex thing. And if For instance, the rule that Benedict wrote works only in a community where everyone is of exactly the same sex. Okay? His rule cannot work in communities where you have like married couples or a man's community and a woman's community intermixed. It simply doesn't work. And they have yet to find a rule that does that. And the reason why it's interesting is because there's a real rise in the church today of married people wanting to live in religious communities, and we have no rule that will make it work. Anyway, whenever they impose these rules from male communities on female communities, those communities ultimately failed. In 1235, a man named Raymond Lully was born to a wealthy family in Mallorca. He married and lived a life of ease as a lyric poet and adventurer until he went through a spiritual conversion. Lyric poets used to travel around, and they were involved in many, many things. If you were having a wedding, you'd hire a lyrical poet. If you were having to honor someone or something, they would compose these things. But the ability to compose these great lyrics, everything, had to do with the number of experiences you had. So you wanted to see how they lived in different areas, you wanted to see ceremonies in different areas, all of this stuff. So these lyrical poets were simultaneously adventurers. They traveled around involved in all kinds of things in order to enrich their poetical work. He went through a spectacular conversion, became a Franciscan, and decided to devote himself to theology and learning. Now remember, that's more a Dominican thing, and initially Francis would not allow his monks to be educated. But after Bonaventure, we mentioned him earlier with Thomas Aquinas, after Bonaventure there come to be more and more highly educated Franciscan theologians, and Raymond was one of these. In his travel, he came to know many Muslims and had learned Arabic, okay? Now, in his travels, I mean his travels as a poet, that he went these different areas and he had learned Arabic. He wanted missionaries to be educated in the culture and the language so that they could approach the Muslims as learned people and preach the gospel. One of the things that you need to understand in carrying the gospel, you need to carry the gospel not only, we're told in the church, you need to not only be a holy person, you need to appear holy, okay? Now you have to be very careful that you don't sacrifice being holy in the process of appearing. But as an example was Mother Teresa. Like Mother Teresa went to India. So when she went to India, how are the ways they define holiness? Well, one of the ways they define holiness, of course, is poverty. And another way they define holiness is the idea of not eating cows. And I go through a whole list of things. Now, you can buy beef in India because there are a lot of Muslims in India. So you can buy beef and stuff. Mother Teresa took the Hindu definition of holiness and followed that. She was a Christian, and none of their principles violate ours. So that those principles don't violate it. But she went to live there. And people were not doing this with regards to the Muslims. Muslim holy men tend to dress in white. They tend to teach in a certain way, and they tend to be very learned. So he wanted them to be very learned, to know Muslim customs, and to be able to speak Arabic. His system, he called the great art, tried to unify all knowledge into a single system. Now remember, we've been taught theology, science, and knowledge cannot be at odds with one another, but no one tried to put them together. He did. He's the first one who tried to put them together. He convinced the Spanish King James to build a college of Miramar to prepare missionaries for Muslim lands. Now, he was eventually arrested preaching himself in Tunis. He was dressed as a Muslim wise man, dressed in their thing, but he was arrested and condemned to death. Finally, he was deported, and he returned to his native country, Majorca. Why don't we call it there and pick it up there next week? Thank you very much.